The boy was mistreated by his own mother for being deaf, until a police dog did the unthinkable. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always awesome to see how far our stories are reaching. Ethan was 10 years old, with fair skin, light brown hair, and blue eyes that stared into the distance as if searching for a sound he'd never hear. Ethan was born deaf. From the moment he was diagnosed, his world grew smaller. His mother, Sarah, a fragile and quiet woman, used to show him tenderness, but over the years, that warmth faded under the weight of her new relationship. Ever since she married Mark, a cold, controlling man with a fake smile, Ethan stopped receiving hugs, kind words, or even glances. To Mark, the boy was a burden. He didn't speak, didn't hear, didn't matter. He just took up space. "He can't even answer when you talk to him," Mark would say to Sarah over and over. "He's broken, Sarah. Why do you keep treating him like he's normal?" Ethan didn't understand the words, but he felt them. He read them on their lips, in their gestures. Every time Mark raised his voice, Ethan shrank back. Not because he understood the tone, but because his body had learned. Loud voice, hard stare, clenched fists meant danger. His mother stopped stepping in. She'd lower her head. Sometimes she cried silently when she thought Ethan was asleep, but he wasn't asleep. He stayed still, motionless, soundless. Sometimes he barely breathed. The night was his only friend. Ethan spent hours staring out the window. He dreamed of a place where he didn't have to pretend he didn't exist. He drew dogs in his old notebook, big dogs with protective eyes. He imagined them by his side, guiding him, understanding him. In his silent world, dogs were the only ones who didn't need words to love. School wasn't much different. Though a teacher named Miss Emily tried to teach him with patience, the other kids avoided him. Some mocked him, making exaggerated gestures to mimic his way of speaking. Others just ignored him. Ethan didn't cry anymore. He'd learned that tears brought no comfort, just more indifference. One morning, the school organized a trip to the local animal shelter. Ethan didn't show any reaction, but inside, something stirred. His heart beat faster. They were going to see dogs. That was enough to make his world a little brighter that day. Sarah signed the permission slip without looking at him. Mark said nothing, just shoved Ethan roughly toward the school bus. Ethan clutched his notebook to his chest. Maybe, just maybe, one of his drawings would come to life today. What Ethan didn't know was that at that same shelter, an old German shepherd named Max had just been transferred. Max had been the partner of a fallen officer named James Carter, loyal, brave, trained to protect. But since James's death, Max refused to follow orders. He barely ate. He didn't respond. They called him a problem dog. They planned to put him down soon if no one adopted him. As the school bus neared the shelter, two broken souls were about to meet. One who could never hear the world, and one who no longer wanted to. The local animal shelter sat on the edge of town, surrounded by bare trees and a rusty metal fence. Inside, barks filled the air, a chaotic chorus of souls begging to be seen, touched, taken home. But in the last cage down the farthest hallway, there was no sound. Only Max, lying quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Max wasn't just any dog. For 7 years, he was the partner of Officer James Carter, patrolling streets, saving lives, sniffing out danger. He'd faced storms, shootouts, fires, but nothing hurt him more than watching James fall just a few feet away, unable to save him. From that day on, Max shut down. He sat by James's body for hours, unmoving. When they pulled him away by force, he stopped eating. He didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't respond to anyone. He just stared, as if waiting for James to come back for him. The shelter workers spoke about him with sadness. "He doesn't want anyone," said a volunteer named Jennifer. "It's like his soul left with his human." The shelter director, a practical and somewhat cold man named Mr. Thompson, had already set a date. If no one adopted Max in a week, he'd be put down. "We can't keep wasting resources on a dog that won't cooperate," he said flatly. That same day, the school bus parked in front of the shelter. Ethan stepped off near the back, his scarf pulled up to his chin, shielding himself from the cold and the world. His steps were slow, almost lifeless, but when he crossed the shelter's doors and felt the vibration of so many barks, something inside him sparked. The other kids ran from cage to cage, pointing, laughing. Ethan didn't. He walked slowly, observing. He didn't look at the dogs that jumped or begged for attention. He was searching for something else, something quiet. Something like him. Then he turned down a lonely hallway and saw him. Max was there, lying with his head between his paws. But when their eyes met, Max's lifted slightly, just for a second, as if something invisible had passed between them. Ethan stopped. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his hands. He approached the cage slowly. He crouched down. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Max raised his head fully. He stood slowly. His ears perked up, not in reaction, but in recognition. He moved closer to the bars. Their faces were inches apart. They stayed like that. In a deep silence the others couldn't understand. A worker watched from a distance, stunned. "That dog doesn't move for anyone," he muttered. Ethan reached out a trembling hand, unafraid. Max, without breaking eye contact, touched it with his nose. Just for a moment. Then he sat back down. But his body was upright, alert, as if he was waiting for something. Ms. Emily, who had followed quietly, came over and knelt beside him. "Do you like that one, Ethan?" she asked softly, using slow, clear signs. Ethan didn't answer with gestures or words. He just touched the cage again. His face held an expression she'd never seen before, like his soul had woken up. After a few minutes, the kids were called back to the bus. Ethan didn't move. They had to call him 3 times. Finally, Ms. Emily took his hand. As they walked away, Ethan looked back. Max did too. Their eyes held on until the last second. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He drew non-stop. Not the barks, not the shelter, just Max, over and over. His notebook filled with pictures of the dog. In one, they were walking together through the snow. In another, Max protected him from a dark monster. Sarah noticed the drawings as she passed by but said nothing. Mark, however, saw them on the table and tore them to pieces. "Stop dreaming about useless things," he growled. "A dog like that will never be yours." Ethan didn't cry. He just picked up the scraps from the floor and kept them like pieces of hope. Mornings at Ethan's house always started with silence, not because they were peaceful, but because tension crept into every corner, like a shadow that wouldn't fade with the light. That morning, with the sky still heavy with clouds, Ethan sat at the table in front of a cold bowl of oatmeal. Sarah, as usual, stood by the sink, avoiding his eyes. Mark flipped through the newspaper, as if nothing else existed. "I saw your teacher yesterday. She said you were distracted all day at the shelter," Mark said without lowering the paper. "Guess you were wasting time dreaming about that useless dog." Ethan didn't react. He kept his eyes down, but inside, each of Mark's words hit like a sharp blow. Sarah turned for a moment, her eyes filled with something like guilt, but she quickly went back to scrubbing a plate that was already clean. Ethan pulled a small drawing from his pocket, one he'd redone in secret. It was Max lying next to him under a tree. He slid it across the table shyly. Sarah came over and picked it up. Her lips parted as if she might say something, but then Mark snatched the drawing from her hands. "Enough, you're too old for fantasies," he said, crumpling it and tossing it into the trash. That afternoon, Ethan didn't go straight home after school. He walked in the opposite direction. He didn't have a watch, but his body knew how much time he had before Mark noticed he was gone. He walked down streets he knew by heart, but each step felt lighter. He had a purpose. When he reached the shelter, the sky was starting to cloud over. Jennifer, the volunteer, saw him arrive and came out to meet him. "Ethan, you shouldn't be here alone," she said, but seeing his eyes, she didn't press. She led him to the hallway where he'd seen Max. The cage was there, just as lonely. Max was lying down, but when he saw the boy, he stood immediately. His body changed, his eyes lit up. He walked to the bars, upright, calm, certain. Ethan crouched down. This time, he pulled a small piece of bread from his backpack, saved from lunch. He broke it in half and offered one piece to Max, who took it gently, never breaking eye contact. Ethan smiled for the first time in weeks. Jennifer watched from a distance. Something stirred in her chest. "That boy and that dog, it's like they already know each other," she whispered to herself. That night, Jennifer decided to talk to the shelter director. "That boy has a bond with Max. Can't we make an exception?" she asked. "A deaf kid with a dog trained for high-risk situations." "You want that to end in disaster," Mr. Thompson replied. "Besides, who's going to sign for the adoption? The mom? The stepdad?" Jennifer lowered her head. She knew he had a point, but something in her heart screamed that they were making a mistake. The next day, Ethan tried to talk to Ms. Emily using signs. With shaky but emotional gestures, he explained that he wanted to adopt Max, that he was his friend. his only friend. Miss Emily listened closely. Then she gently touched his head. "I'll try, okay? But you need to be patient," she said. Ethan nodded. He didn't need words to know hope had entered his life. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. That afternoon, Miss Emily called Sarah. She explained how Ethan felt, how Max reacted to him, how their bond was rare and special. Sarah stayed quiet on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, "I have to talk to Mark," but that "I have to talk" was just a cover for what she already knew would happen. When she told Mark, he laughed coldly. "You want to bring a police dog into this house? For that useless kid? No way, Sarah. Don't even think about it." Sarah didn't reply. She just sat on the bed staring at the floor. Inside, something was breaking. Not just for Ethan, for herself too, for the years of silence, for everything she'd allowed. That night, Ethan didn't eat. He locked himself in his room and sat by the window. He knew the answer was no. He felt it in the air, but he didn't cry. Instead, he looked at the stars, and in his heart, something grew stronger. If no one would help him, he'd find a way himself. The winter grew harsher that week. Snow blanketed the rooftops like heavy quilts, and frosted windows let out only a faint trace of light. Inside the house, the air was colder than outside. Mark came home early from work that day. His hard, always grim face looked even tenser. He tossed his keys onto the table with a thud and poured himself a drink without greeting anyone. Sarah, sitting by the stove, barely lifted her eyes. Ethan was in his corner, drawing quietly as usual. "Still at it?" Mark snapped, seeing the papers in Ethan's hands. "I told you that dog's not coming here. Are you deaf or what?" Sarah held her breath. Ethan didn't respond, just lowered his head. Mark stepped closer, grabbed Ethan's drawing, a picture of Max running beside him, and tore it up right in front of him. Ethan pressed his lips together. His small fists clenched, but he didn't react. Sarah stood awkwardly. "Mark, please," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Please what? Now you're going against me too? That kid needs discipline, not more fantasies." Mark's tone turned sharper. He stepped toward Ethan with heavy steps. The boy backed away a little, but he knew there was nowhere to go. Then, out of nowhere, Mark raised his hand and struck Ethan on the side. Ethan fell to the floor, silent, curling up and covering himself with his arms. Sarah screamed, "Stop! My God, he's just a kid!" Mark turned to her, his face twisted. "A kid who's good for nothing. Can't even understand when you talk to him. A useless piece of furniture with legs." Sarah covered her mouth with her hands. Fear froze her for seconds. It wasn't the first time she'd seen Mark like this, but he'd never hit Ethan in front of her before. Her son's silence was worse than any scream. That night, Sarah went to Ethan's room. She found him sitting on the bed, eyes wide, staring into the dark. He had a blanket over his shoulders, his breathing faint. She knelt beside him slowly, unsure what to say. She stroked his hair gently. Ethan didn't move, but when she stood to leave, he softly grabbed her hand. Sarah didn't cry, but something inside her broke for good. She went to the bathroom, turned on the light, and stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. She didn't recognize herself anymore. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Jennifer noticed a strange change in Max. Since Ethan's last visit, the dog started moving more, staying alert. At night, he'd go to the door as if waiting for someone. He wasn't the lifeless animal he'd been before. Something had woken him up. "You miss him, don't you?" Jennifer said, petting his head. "But I don't know if we can save you in time." The next day at school, Ethan didn't join in any activities. Miss Emily noticed bruises under his neck. She knelt to his level. "What happened, Ethan? Did you fall?" she asked. Ethan shook his head, his eyes filling with held-back tears. "Ms. Emily touched his arm gently. "Was it your stepdad?" Ethan didn't answer, but his lips trembled. That was enough. Later, Ms. Emily filed a confidential report with Child Protective Services. It was delicate, but she couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Sarah was called to the school. When confronted, she didn't deny anything. She just lowered her head and said, "He won't let me protect him. I don't know how to do it alone anymore." That confession started an investigation. But before the authorities could act, Mark found out about the report. That same night, his rage exploded at home. "You talked to the school? You brought them into our house? They want to take him away, Sarah. They want to ruin my life over a useless kid," he yelled. Sarah tried to reason with him, but Mark was out of control. He grabbed Ethan by the arm and shook him hard. "You're staying locked in this room until I say so, got it?" Ethan didn't understand the words, but he knew the hate-filled eyes, the sharp tone, the door slammed shut. That night, in the dark room, Ethan felt something shift inside him. It wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. Max was out there. He knew Max would wait for him, he just had to find a way to reach him. Ethan waited until the house fell into a thick, total silence. He knew Mark drank more when he was angry, and that night was no different. He felt the creak of the couch, the faint hum of the TV, then nothing. A void that for others might mean rest, but for him was his only chance. He slid the blanket off carefully and got up without a sound. He wore a thin, long-sleeve shirt, too light for the freezing cold outside, but he had no choice. He put on his shoes slowly, feeling each step with his fingers. Then he opened the window with effort. It was narrow, but Ethan was slim and quick. He slipped through the frame, his heart pounding hard in his chest. Snow fell again, and the icy wind stung his face as soon as he hit the ground. He walked away from the main road, taking a shortcut behind the houses. He didn't have a clear plan. He only knew he needed to find the shelter. Max. His mind repeated that name over and over like a beacon. His fingers started to go numb. His nose burned from the cold air, but he kept going. Each step was an act of will. Each yard he crossed was a silent cry for freedom. Trouble came when he reached the bend in the old country road. Lights flashed behind him. Ethan turned. It was Mark's truck. The engine roared like a threat. He didn't need to understand the words spilling from Mark's mouth. The man's twisted face said it all. Ethan ran. The snow slowed him down, but he tried. His body moved as if powered by the memory of blows, senseless yells, and the sour smell of alcohol. He ran like never before. The truck didn't hit him. It stopped a few yards away, and Mark stormed out like an enraged bull. He grabbed Ethan's arm and shook him hard. "You think you can run from me, you little punk?" he spat, not caring that the boy couldn't hear. "You're mine, you're not going anywhere." Ethan struggled, kicked, but he was small. His body wasn't strong enough. Mark dragged him back to the truck and shoved him inside roughly. Ethan hit his head on the edge of the seat and felt a brief dizziness. The world spun for a moment. Then something no one expected happened. From the nearby woods, a figure burst through the snow. A large, swift body with dark fur and steady eyes. Max. The dog had escaped the shelter hours earlier. No one knew how, but his cage was found open at dawn. Max had followed an invisible trail, driven by an urge he couldn't explain. It wasn't instinct. It was something deeper, a bond that needed no words. When he saw Ethan being forced into the truck, Max didn't hesitate. He charged straight at them. Mark didn't see him coming. He only heard a low growl, then felt the dog's weight crash into his back. He fell to the ground with a yell. Max didn't bite. He just knocked Mark down and stood firm between him and Ethan, baring his teeth, his back bristling. Mark tried to get up, but Max didn't budge. He protected the boy with fierce conviction. Ethan, dazed, watched the scene like it was a dream. His eyes filled with tears. He reached out and touched Max's warm fur. Max turned his head slightly. He had found him. He had come. But headlights from another car lit up the scene. It was a police cruiser. Someone had called about a disturbance. The officer stepped out quickly, hand on his gun. "Freeze! Everybody down!" he shouted. Ethan covered his face. Max stayed still, not aggressive, but alert. The officer recognized the dog right away. "Max, what are you doing here?" It was Sergeant John Miller, who had known Max when he patrolled with James. He approached slowly with respect. "Easy, boy. It's okay. We won't hurt him," he said. Mark, on the ground, shouted nonsense. But he couldn't get away. He was handcuffed right there while Max stayed close to Ethan. That night, Ethan didn't go back home. He was taken by social services, and Max went with him. No one stopped them. No one dared to separate them. The sun was just peeking over the mountains when Ethan opened his eyes. He wasn't sure where he was, but the smell of wood, dampness, and wet earth told him right away. An emergency shelter, deep in the woods. An old, forgotten hunting cabin where they'd placed him temporarily until a judge decided his custody. For now, he couldn't go back to Sarah, and definitely not to Mark, who was in jail awaiting trial. Max slept beside him, curled up like a protective shadow. His warm fur brushed Ethan's leg, and the boy still feared it was all a fragile dream. Ethan sat up slowly, wrapping himself in the thick blanket they'd given him. The air was heavy and cold, but his hands didn't shake. Max opened one eye and, seeing Ethan awake, stretched with a deep yawn before sitting calmly beside him. They didn't need words. Ethan smiled for the first time in days, a shy but real smile. Quietly, he leaned toward Max, rested his forehead on the dog's head and closed his eyes. Max stayed still, solid as a rock. He knew his job wasn't done. Over the next few days, a social worker named Mrs. Larson visited regularly. She was a tall woman with grey hair, Scandinavian roots, kind gestures and tired eyes. She brought thermoses of hot soup, clean clothes, and books with big pictures. She tried to communicate with Ethan using drawings and gestures. He responded little, but whenever Max was near, he seemed more confident. One afternoon, while Mrs. Larson took notes in her notebook, Max grew restless. His ears perked up. He walked to the cabin door, sniffing the air, scratching the wood lightly. Ethan stood, curious, and followed him outside. The woods were covered in thick but gentle fog. Max walked with purpose through the trees. Ethan followed, unafraid. Soon they reached a small slope leading to a creek. Max stopped and sat. Ethan did too. There, in that hidden corner of the world, Ethan pulled a new notebook from his pocket. Mrs. Larson had given it to him. With careful hands, he started to draw. This time it wasn't just Max. It was both of them, together, in a forest clearing. Above their heads, a faint figure like an angel made of light. Max watched quietly, head tilted, as if he understood every line. When Ethan finished, he showed him the drawing. Max lifted a paw and touched the page. Ethan laughed, a quiet laugh full of heart. That night, a sudden storm hit. The wind slammed against the cabin's wooden walls like it wanted to tear them down. Max stayed up, alert, all night. Each thunderclap shook the structure, but Ethan didn't wake. For the first time in a long time, he slept deeply. He felt safe. At dawn, Max went to check the area around the cabin. When he came back, he carried something in his mouth, an old blue handkerchief with JC stitched in one corner. Ethan took it carefully. He smelled it. It still held a faint scent of tobacco and leather. Mrs. Larson later explained it belonged to Officer James Carter, Max's partner. He kept it all this time. Maybe he thought one day James would come back for him, she said. That night, Ethan didn't draw. He sat with Max, tied the handkerchief around the dog's neck, and leaned against him. The days in the woods became a sacred pause, a time where pain couldn't reach. Ethan learned to sense sounds through vibrations, like when Max barked at a bird too close, or scratched the ground before rain. He couldn't hear, but he felt, and Max didn't speak, but he understood. The winter sun shone weakly through bare branches when retired Sergeant John Miller arrived at the cabin. He wore an olive-green military jacket, his face weathered by years, his walk slow but steady. Mrs. Larson had called him days earlier after confirming the handkerchief Ethan found. It was James Carter's, the fallen officer who'd considered Max his family. John stepped out of his truck carefully. He didn't want to scare the boy or the dog. He knew trauma didn't heal with rushed words. He walked to the entrance, and there, leaning against the wood, was Max. The dog stood right away. His tail stayed still, but his eyes gleamed with something deep, like a memory waking up. "Hey, old friend," John whispered, kneeling. Max sniffed him, circled him slowly, then rested his head on John's chest with a soft whimper as if saying, "I've been waiting for you." Ethan came out just then. Seeing the man and his dog like that, he stopped. He watched with caution but no fear. John stood and looked Ethan in the eyes. Then, with clumsy but honest hands, he used basic sign language. It wasn't perfect, but enough to say, "I knew Max. He was family." Ethan blinked, surprised. He looked at Max. The dog sat between them, like he was sealing an invisible pact. Silently, Ethan nodded. That afternoon, John sat with Mrs. Larson, a notebook on his knees. "You know that boy could be the key to reopening the case against Mark," he said quietly. "No one's heard his side. No one let him speak. And no one took the time to learn his language," Mrs. Larson added sadly. John took a deep breath. He explained what he knew. Mark had been getting state money to care for Ethan, a monthly stipend for special needs cases. He'd likely used it for himself. There were past reports of domestic violence, but Mark always managed to hush them up. He had influence, connections, but now with Ethan safe and Max as a silent witness, things could change. That dog, John said, protected him when no one else dared. Later, Miss Emily was called to testify. She described the signs, the bruises, the withdrawn behavior. She showed Ethan's drawings, each page a wordless confession. The judge, a reserved and stern man, reviewed everything in silence. Max was allowed in the courtroom. When Ethan walked in, trembling inside, the dog stayed by his side, head high, alert. Ethan clutched his notebook to his chest like a shield. With an interpreter's help, Ethan finally shared his story. He told it through signs and drawings, everything he'd endured. When he finished, he placed a page on the judge's table. Mark as a dark shadow with red eyes, and Max rising in front of Ethan like a glowing wall. The judge sat still for a long moment. Then he spoke firmly. This boy doesn't need more silence. He needs justice and a home. At the end of the hearing, Mark was formally charged with abuse, fraud, and neglect. Sarah, called as a witness, admitted through tears that she'd stayed quiet out of fear, but didn't want to lose her son. She promised to get help, but she knew it would take time to earn Ethan's trust back. After the session, Ethan didn't want to talk. He just walked to Max, hugged his neck, and stayed there while John watched, a lump in his throat. "No doubt about it," John muttered to Mrs. Larson. "That boy and that dog, they saved each other." It was the middle of the night when the call came to Mrs. Larson's phone. Her usually calm face tightened as she heard the officer's voice. "Mark escaped," he said grimly. "He got away during transport. We think he's after the boy." Mrs. Larson hung up without a word. Outside, the snow fell with fury. The woods, which had felt like a sanctuary until yesterday, now seemed like a threat. John Miller was already in his truck when the police called. He drove straight to the cabin. He didn't need directions. He knew Max's instincts would be faster than any siren. Inside the cabin, Ethan slept. Max, though, was awake, restless. Something in the air had alerted him. He stood and walked to the door, his back bristling, senses sharp. He scratched the wood hard. Ethan opened his eyes and sat up instantly. Max turned to him, giving a soft growl, not aggressive, but a warning. Then, a crunch. Footsteps in the snow. Max tensed. Ethan held his breath. The door flew open. Mark stood there, soaked, clothes torn, eyes wild with rage. He held a rusty wrench, big and heavy, his teeth gritted. He wasn't there to talk. "Give him to me," he screamed, pointing at Ethan. "That kid is mine. They stole him from me." Ethan backed away instinctively. Max stepped in front of him, solid as a wall. He bared his teeth. His growl was deep, different from before. A final warning. Mark tried to move forward. That was his mistake. Max lunged. The impact knocked Mark down hard. The wrench fell from his hands, sliding across the icy wood. Max didn't bite. He just pinned Mark to the ground, pressing with his weight and growling by his ear, making it clear he wasn't getting up. Ethan ran to a corner, trembling, but he soon saw Mark couldn't move. He was beaten, not by force, but by fear. John arrived then, gun in hand. Seeing the scene, he didn't need to act. Max had done his job. John approached calmly. "Good boy. You can let him go now," he whispered. Max obeyed but kept his eyes on Mark. John handcuffed the man with steady hands as the police cruiser pulled up behind. Sarah arrived minutes later with Mrs. Larson. Her eyes were swollen, her face wrecked. "Is he okay?" she asked, searching for Ethan. Ethan saw her. He didn't run to her arms, but he didn't pull away either. Sarah knelt in front of him. "I'm so sorry. So sorry," she whispered, hands shaking. "I left you alone when you needed me most. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm here now. I'm not leaving." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped closer slowly, Max by his side. He reached out and touched her fingers. A small gesture, but enough to break years of silence. Sarah cried quietly. John, in the background, took a deep breath. He knew that moment was stronger than any court ruling. That night, Mark went back to a cell, but Ethan, at last, was free. Weeks had passed since that night when Ethan's past was finally faced. The snow began to melt slowly, as if the winter, like his pain, was giving way to a quiet spring. The trial against Mark was quick. The evidence was clear. Ethan's story, translated precisely by his interpreter, medical reports, drawings that showed his suffering without question, and Max's testimony, not in words but in actions that moved even the jury. The dog stayed by Ethan's side the whole time in court, steady, watchful, as if he knew that moment would shape his boy's future. Mark was convicted of abuse, gross neglect, and misusing public funds. The sentence was harsh. For the first time, Ethan could breathe without feeling someone watching him with menace. Sarah started emotional rehabilitation. She joined support groups for women who'd lived through abusive relationships. She visited Ethan under supervision, bringing small gifts she made herself, a blue knit cap, a blanket with stars stitched on it. Ethan didn't reject them, but he didn't open up fully either. Trust isn't rebuilt with promises, and he knew that even without hearing. During this time, Ethan stayed with John Miller and his wife, Susan, a woman with a soft voice and hands always busy with crafts. They had no kids, but always wanted a family. When they met Ethan, something in them settled. There were no big speeches or grand gestures, just routine, respect, and care. Susan started learning sign language. Ethan, curious, took an interest in teaching her small signs. With her, he laughed at simple things. With John, he walked in the mornings with Max by his side, breathing in the world like it was new. Slowly, the night stopped being scary. He slept without waking in a panic. He dreamed again, and now his dreams weren't of escape, but of staying. Max changed too. Tell me in the comments, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story so far? Your opinion means a lot to me. He ran with joy again. His eyes, once dull, sparkled when he saw Ethan wake. He slept at the foot of Ethan's bed, went with him to the special school where Ethan finally had classmates who signed like him. He wasn't the only silent one anymore. He was part of something. And amazingly, Max seemed to understand even the smallest gestures of the other students. He became the class mascot, a guardian loved by all. One day, during a family meeting with social workers, John handed Ethan a brown envelope. Inside were papers with big letters and a photo from a few days earlier. Ethan, Susan, and Max sitting in the backyard with an apple pie on the table. The words were clear: official adoption request. Ethan read it, and his eyes filled with tears. He looked up slowly at the two adults and signed a short, clear word: family. Susan cried openly. John just nodded, eyes wet, unable to speak. Max, lying on the floor, wagged his tail. That night, Ethan placed a new drawing on his desk. It showed 4 figures: him, Max, John, and Susan holding hands with a blooming forest in the background. Above them, in the clouds, James Carter's faint outline smiled, touching Max's shoulder with a hand of light. It was spring. The trees, once bare and sleeping, started to wear green. Wildflowers sprouted between the rocks on the path to Ethan's new home, a simple wooden house with a wide porch, where a woven blanket and a pair of muddy boots always hung. That's where he lived now, with John, Susan, and Max. Every morning had a ritual. Ethan woke with the first rays of sun through the window. Max was already waiting at the foot of the bed, tail wagging gently as if saying, "The world's waiting for us." Ethan washed his face, dressed carefully, and went to the yard. They didn't need to talk. Sometimes they walked to the lake. Other times, they just sat under the old oak in the backyard. Susan made breakfast while humming softly. She didn't do it for Ethan to hear, but because it came from her heart. Though he couldn't hear her, he learned to read the music in her movements, the way her feet shifted, the shape her hands took cutting fruit or pouring tea. At school, Ethan no longer avoided other kids. He joined classes, asked questions in sign language, and even told small stories with drawings and gestures. He'd learned to trust his voice, even if it had no sound. One afternoon, Ms. Emily visited. Seeing him, her eyes filled with emotion. Ethan hugged her without shyness. He showed her his new room, his books, his notebooks full of drawings. In one, he had a story called "The Day the World Found Me." "Can I take it with me?" Ms. Emily asked in signs. Ethan thought for a moment, then nodded, but he gave her another notebook too, a smaller one, with a hand-drawn cover showing Max in a superhero cape. It was his gift. John had turned part of the garage into a training and play space for Max. He kept him active, not out of duty, but to honor James Carter's memory. Sometimes Ethan watched Max respond to old police signals he still remembered, but now his real mission was different. Protect, stay close, love. One morning, a letter came. Ethan opened it with Susan's help. It was an official invitation from the town. They wanted to honor Max for his service and recent heroism. The ceremony would be at the Central Park. Ethan didn't say anything. He just stared at the letter for a long time. Then he hugged Max and kissed his head. On the day of the ceremony, A crowd gathered. Officers, neighbors, teachers, kids, and elderly folks all wanted to see the angel dog, as the newspapers called him. Ethan went on stage with John. He wore a blue jacket and a white handkerchief around his neck, like the one James Carter used. Max walked beside him, calm, eyes steady. When they gave him the medal, Ethan held it with both hands and placed it gently on Max's neck. Then he raised his hands, looked at the crowd, and signed, "This dog saved my life, but he also taught me how to live it." A deafening applause broke out. Many didn't understand the signs, but they felt them. Some things don't need translation. That night back home, Ethan sat by the window. Outside, fireflies danced among the bushes. Max slept at his feet. John read the paper, and Susan knitted a new blanket. Ethan took a blank sheet and wrote in clear, bold letters, "I don't need to hear the world, because now the world hears me." Then he closed his eyes and smiled. 2 years passed. Ethan grew up in silence, but he was never alone again. In John and Susan's home, he bloomed like never before. He learned to plant flowers, bake cookies with his adoptive mum, and even fix small engines with John. He no longer shied away from touch or eye contact. His eyes shone. His laugh, though silent, was the loudest of all. Sarah, his biological mother, stayed committed to her healing. With therapy and steady support, she reclaimed her dignity and her role as a loving presence. Ethan visited her slowly, without rush. He didn't reject her, but he didn't fully return to her either. They built something new, a relationship based on truth. No masks, no empty promises. She learned that loving sometimes means letting go, and being there when they come back to you. No one spoke of Mark again. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and he vanished from Ethan's world forever. Max grew older. His fur lightened, his steps slowed, but his eyes never changed. He kept sleeping at the foot of Ethan's bed, going with him to school, lying beside him during quiet afternoons, reading in the yard. When Ethan had his first nightmare in a long time, Max woke him with a gentle nudge of his nose. When Ethan got his first fever, Max stayed by his side for 2 full nights, and one golden autumn afternoon, Max simply lay down under the shade of the old oak and stayed there, peaceful. Ethan knew. There was no panic. He knelt, hugged him, and signed, "Thank you for staying with me." Max let out a soft breath, like a sigh, gently, as only those who've finished their mission leave. Max was buried there in the yard. John carved a small wooden plaque with words Ethan chose silently. "He wasn't a dog. He was the voice that taught me to hear." Every year on his birthday, Ethan leaves a white flower there. Then he goes back home, opens his notebook, and starts a new story. Now he writes, for other kids who might not hear the world but need to be heard. And in every page, hidden among the characters, is always him, a German shepherd with wise eyes who never needs to speak. Because sometimes all someone needs is to be found by a 4-legged angel. Thank you so much for sticking with this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a ton and motivates us to keep bringing new stories every week. And since you're here, take a moment to check out another one of our stories that's popping up on your screen. Big hug and see you next time. Stay well.